Get your hands up right now! The shout hit Dr. Elena Thompson before she even turned her head, loud enough to slice through the quiet path and send a sharp rush of fear up her spine. She had barely finished her stretch when Sergeant Frank Harlan closed the distance in long, angry strides, his hand hovering near his holster as if he had already decided she was a threat. Officer Kyle Benson trailed behind him, uneasy, eyes darting between Elena and his partner, unsure how far this was about to go. The order wasn't a warning. It was a verdict delivered before she even opened her mouth. Elena raised her hands, breath catching for a moment, the early calm swallowed by a familiar dread she hadn't felt since childhood. Before we continue this story, tell me where you're watching from, and if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps more than you know. The morning had started like every other for Elena, quiet and steady, the kind of early hour she relied on to clear her mind before stepping into the chaos of Northwestern Memorial Hospital. She preferred the simplicity of dawn. Running offered her a place where she could breathe without titles, without cameras, without the pressure of being both a pediatric surgeon and the First Lady of Illinois. At 48, she carried a lifetime of responsibility on her shoulders, yet in those early minutes of the day, she felt weightless. She always kept her state ID and her Rolex tucked away in her running belt, more out of habit than precaution. In Lincoln Park, she was used to nods of recognition, polite smiles, the kind of quiet respect that came with her work and her public life. That morning, a neighbor had waved, a dog trotted past her. Marcus had sent her a short text before his own long day began. "Love you. Stay safe." She responded with a heart, tied her jacket around her waist, and moved along the path near the lake, unaware of what waited in the shadows of the patrol car 30 yards away. Harlan had been watching her long before she saw him. He sat in the cruiser, binoculars pressed to his face, muttering to himself with the same resentment that had colored his 18 years on the force. Alcohol still buzzed in his blood from the night before. He carried old grudges like armor, shaped by a father who told him from boyhood that people like Elena didn't belong anywhere near neighborhoods like this. Benson, younger and anxious, kept glancing at him but said nothing. He had bills, a wife, a baby on the way. When Harlan said jump, he jumped. When Harlan said write a false, suspicious person report, he typed it without asking why. He didn't believe Elena had done anything wrong. He just didn't believe he had the power to stop what was coming. When Harlan stormed toward her with the command that shattered the morning, Elena tried to respond calmly, hoping clarity might pierce through whatever anger drove him. "Is something wrong?" "Officer?" she asked, her voice steady. That only pushed him further. He circled her, eyes cold, movements sharp, as if searching for something that could justify the aggression already burning inside him. Then came the order she never expected. "Take off your shoes." For a moment she thought she misheard, but the look in his eyes removed any doubt. She slipped off her Nikes and stood barefoot, the pavement cool under her feet, her heart beating in a slow, controlled cadence. That was when he stepped closer, lifted a hand toward her hair, and made a remark he didn't even hesitate to say. It wasn't only offensive, it was dismissive. A reminder that in his mind she wasn't a respected surgeon. She wasn't the governor's wife. She wasn't even a woman with dignity. She was a target. Benson shifted behind him, his unease growing. But he stayed silent, torn between conscience and fear. Then the sound of tearing fabric cut through the air. Benson gripped her jacket and yanked hard, ripping it open along the seam before she even understood what he was doing. The shock froze her for a moment. Her breath stilled. The cold morning pressed against her exposed sports bra, and a ripple went through the small crowd forming nearby. People stopped walking, phones lifted, No one intervened. They only watched, some with disbelief, some with fear, some with the guilt of knowing they should say something but didn't. Elena folded her arms instinctively, trying to cover herself, feeling a wave of humiliation harder to swallow than the fear itself. She reminded Harlan of her rights, her voice firm but calm, a tone she used with parents whose children clung to life inside hospital walls. He cut her off, his reply sharp as stone. "Your rights are what I say they are." He spun her around and snapped the cuffs on her wrists, pulling her arms high enough to send a sting through her shoulders. She felt the world tilt slightly, not from pain, but from the disbelief that this moment, this degradation, was happening in the same city where she spent her life saving children who couldn't speak for themselves. Then came the cruelest moment. Harlan lifted his phone and took a picture, a trophy, a habit he had honed through years of unchecked behavior. Benson flinched. A woman watching whispered, "Dear God." Elena kept her gaze low, steadying her breath, refusing to let her humiliation be the last thing she remembered from this morning. What happened next lasted seconds, but would define the months that followed. Harlan reached into her running belt, digging through her belongings with the careless aggression of someone sure he wouldn't be held accountable. Then he froze. The ID in his hand gleamed in the morning light. He read the name, blinked, and read it again. Elena Thompson. He murmured, "First Lady of Illinois." His face drained, his breath caught. The certainty that fueled his anger cracked open all at once. Benson leaned closer, saw the name, and stepped back as if he had touched fire. "Frank, what did you do?" For the first time since the encounter began. Silence settled around them. The park seemed to hold the moment still. Elena, even with her wrists bound and her jacket torn, lifted her chin slowly. In that single motion, she reclaimed what they tried to take from her. And Harlan, staring at the ID he never expected to see, understood that the world he had created for himself, the fear, the power, the cruelty, was about to crumble. The video hit TikTok before Elena even made it home, uploaded by a jogger who had stopped just long enough to capture the humiliation. And within minutes, the world had already formed its own judgment. The clip opened with her jacket being torn, her arms instinctively crossing her chest, and the officer's voice echoing across the path. It traveled through the city like a spark landing on dry grass, and by 7:10 a.m., it had racked up more than 1 million views. People didn't know who she was at first. They only saw a black woman standing barefoot and exposed in a park where she had every right to be. But when someone zoomed in on her ID in Harlan's shaking hand, everything shifted. The caption changed from police harassment in Lincoln Park to governor's wife humiliated by CPD. By the time Marcus Thompson checked his phone during his education reform meeting, 3 staffers were already whispering behind him, glancing at him, then at the screen, unsure whether to interrupt. When he finally opened the video, he stopped breathing for a long moment as the image of his wife, torn jacket, hands cuffed, face steady but shaken, filled the screen. He excused himself quietly, walked into the hallway, and called her. She answered on the first ring, her voice steady but thin. "I'm okay," she said before he could speak. "Don't panic." But panic was already rising in him like rising floodwater. "Where are you? Are you safe? I'm sending security right now." She resisted, not wanting the morning to become a political circus before she even gathered her thoughts. But he insisted. She sat in the passenger seat of the state SUV, wrapped in a borrowed hoodie from a woman in the park, while the officers assigned to the governor drove her home in silence. The scandal raced through Chicago faster than any official could catch up. Reporters swarmed Lincoln Park, replaying the video frame by frame, trying to identify the officers. Harlan and Benson slipped away before cameras arrived, but not fast enough to avoid being recognized by other officers. At the Tribune. A headline was drafted within minutes. Police humiliate governor's wife during morning jog at City Hall. Staff scrambled to answer calls they didn't yet understand. At the Chicago Police Headquarters, Chief Edward Lang phoned Internal Affairs, demanding damage control before anyone even asked what happened. Meanwhile, Elena stepped into her home quietly, her hands still trembling despite her attempts to steady them. She moved through the living room as if the air had thickened. She sat on the couch and folded her hands, staring at the floor. She didn't cry. She rarely cried, but she couldn't stop replaying the moment the jacket tore, the moment the camera phones lifted, the moment she realized that her humiliation had become a spectacle for strangers. Sophia Grant, her closest friend since their childhood on the South Side, arrived within 20 minutes. Having seen the video before Elena even texted her, Sophia dropped to her knees in front of her, placed her hands on Elena's, and whispered, "You didn't deserve this. Not again. Not ever." Elena's breath shook, not from the physical trauma, but from the memory that rose without warning. She saw her father again, the officers that night in 1989, the sound of a baton striking bone, the taste of fear she thought she had outgrown. She pressed a hand to her chest, reminding herself she was no longer that terrified girl. She was a surgeon, a mother, a first lady, and yet, the fear felt exactly the same, across the city. Harlan sat in his living room with a drink in his hand, watching the video on loop, his face drained. He knew the moment he saw her name on that ID that his career was over, but watching the video spread made another truth sink in. His control was gone. The anger that fueled him for years suddenly had nowhere left to go. He called his ex-wife, voice cracking, trying to explain, trying to say he didn't mean for it to go that far. She hung up after 6 seconds. "Do not call this house again," she said. Benson faced his own storm. His wife, Jessica, saw the video at work and texted him, "Tell me you're not the one tearing her jacket." He didn't reply. He couldn't. His stomach twisted with guilt so heavy it felt physical. He had followed Harlan blindly for years, convincing himself obedience was survival, but watching the video through the eyes of the public, he saw himself with a clarity he had avoided, a grown man tearing the jacket off a respected woman because another man told him to. He felt ashamed, lost, terrified. Meanwhile, the city's political machine shifted into crisis mode. Marcus's communications team begged him to issue a controlled statement. His advisors worried the incident might impact his re-election numbers among white suburban voters. Elena, still sitting quietly on her couch, overheard some of the frantic discussions from Marcus's office. When he finally emerged and sat beside her, she took his hand and whispered, "This cannot be about politics. Not this time." He nodded, torn between his fear for her and the harsh reality of an election year. By noon, the ACLU released a statement demanding an independent investigation. Civil rights attorneys held press calls. Volunteers organized a march before evening even arrived. TikTok opinion videos spread by the thousands, many recorded by Black women sharing their own stories of being searched, dismissed, or humiliated. Twitter reached nearly 4 million mentions of Elena's name within hours. What had started as a quiet morning run had now become a national conversation about policing, racism, and power, and through it all, Elena tried to breathe. Sophia made tea and sat beside her. They watched the video together, frame by frame. When the phone camera caught Elena flinching as her jacket tore, Sophia whispered, "This isn't just one bad officer. This is a pattern." Elena nodded, feeling the full truth settle in her chest. She wasn't just a victim. She was the latest in a long chain of women whose dignity had been stolen by the same man. Another truth emerged that neither woman said out loud yet. This incident, no matter how painful, might finally force the world to see what so many had endured in silence. Late that afternoon, a small but important moment occurred. Elena stood in her daughter's bedroom doorway and watched her 20-year-old daughter, Sarah, silently packing for her return to Harvard. Sarah looked up, eyes filled with a mixture of anger and worry. "Mom, I'm proud of you," she said, "but I'm scared for us." Elena stepped inside, placed a hand on her daughter's cheek, and answered softly, "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward anyway." She meant it. She felt it. But as she walked back down the hallway, she also knew that the road ahead would be long, public, and painful. By sunset, the foundation of the scandal was set. Harlan was placed on immediate suspension. Benson was ordered to report to Internal Affairs the next morning. Chief Lang called a late-night meeting, panicked at how quickly the story was spiraling beyond his control. And Elena, wrapped in the same borrowed hoodie, sat at her kitchen table as her phone buzzed endlessly with messages of support from strangers she would never meet. She closed her eyes, took a slow breath, and whispered to herself, "This is not over." And she was right. The story that began in a quiet park would soon uncover years of buried truths, a chain of victims, a corrupt network, and the unraveling of careers built on abuse. The storm had only just begun. By 10 a.m., the case had already shifted from a local embarrassment to a federal emergency, and Special Agent Lisa Moreno stepped onto the scene with the heavy calm of someone who had spent years walking into disasters created by people who thought they were untouchable. She reviewed the viral videos, the initial police reports, and the panicked statements coming out of City Hall. And within minutes, she made the call that changed everything. "We're opening a civil rights investigation." Her voice was even, her posture steady, her mind already racing ahead. Moreno had handled cases in Ferguson, Milwaukee, and Minneapolis. She had seen officers lie to her face, delete footage, hide evidence, and bury complaints. She also knew how to find the truth underneath all that rot. She sent her team directly to Chicago Police Headquarters and ordered immediate seizure of Harlan and Benson's body cam devices. The first officer she encountered claimed the footage hadn't uploaded yet. The second insisted there might have been a technical malfunction. Moreno didn't raise her voice. She simply replied, "Then we'll recover it manually." Her team did exactly that. A small group of digital forensic analysts worked through the morning, including a volunteer hacker connected with a Black Lives Matter tech collective. Within hours, they recovered the deleted files. When Moreno watched the raw body cam clip, she didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened. She watched Harlan close in on Elena, watched him circle her, watched Benson tear her jacket as if stripping dignity were a routine part of the job. The audio captured Harlan's voice with chilling clarity. "Your rights are what I say they are." Moreno paused the footage, exhaled slowly, and whispered, "This man has done this before." What emerged next confirmed her instinct. Harlan's personnel file looked thin at first, too thin. Only 4 minor complaints, all resolved. But when the FBI pulled the archived logs, the sealed internal memos, and the union-protected records that CPD had quietly buried, the truth surfaced like a corpse rising from deep water. Over 18 years, Sergeant Frank Harlan had amassed 32 complaints, most involving black women. Over half had been labeled unsubstantiated within hours of being filed. Several complaints carried identical language, copied and pasted from unrelated cases. Moreno's team searched his personal phone, obtained through warrant, and found something worse. 89 photos taken on duty, all showing terrified women, jackets torn, bra straps exposed, hands cuffed, eyes swollen from crying. Trophies, evidence of humiliation he wanted to remember. When Moreno saw the folder labeled uppity, she closed her eyes for one heavy breath, then said, "Bring me the victims." The first to speak was a woman whose name Elena had whispered through tears earlier that morning. Dr. Sophia Grant. In 2019, Harlan had stopped Sophia outside a parking garage after a night shift and claimed she matched a report. He made her remove her coat, searched her hair while mocking her natural curls, then took a picture of her in her bra. She filed a complaint. It disappeared within 48 hours. She never knew why. When Sophia sat in the interview room with Moreno, her hands trembled as she relived the night she had tried so hard to forget. He looked proud. She whispered, proud of what he did. Moreno nodded gently. "You're not alone, and we're going to prove it," as victims surfaced. The investigation widened, reaching into corners the city had ignored for years. A nurse named Carla Evans came forward with a story so similar it made Moreno's stomach twist. Carla had been stopped in 2021 with her 10-year-old son. Harlan had forced her to put her hands on the hood of her car in front of the child. Making crude comments she refused to repeat. Her son cried the entire time. When she filed her complaint, she received a letter saying insufficient evidence. Moreno realized immediately that this pattern wasn't negligence. It was orchestration. Someone at the top had been clearing Harlan's name. The FBI traced emails, phone logs, and union transfers, and they found it. A directive sent from Chief Edward Lang months earlier. Clear Harlan's file before the election. 19 victims came forward within 48 hours. Some broke down in tears. Others spoke with quiet determination. A few brought copies of their old complaint letters, still folded in their wallets as reminders of the day they lost faith in the system. When Moreno reviewed the full scope, she whispered, "This isn't misconduct. This is conspiracy." Meanwhile, Elena tried to navigate her own storm. She attended a trauma support session at the urging of Sophia, sitting in a circle of women who shared stories almost identical to hers. She listened as Sophia recounted her 2019 assault. She watched other women tremble as they described their encounters. She felt anger rise beneath her ribs, not for herself, but for them, for all the women who had been silenced long before the cameras ever turned on. But anger wasn't the whole truth. Fear still clung to her, a quiet shadow she struggled to shake. At night, she replayed her father's beating in her mind. The sirens, the voices, the helplessness. Marcus tried to comfort her, sometimes sitting beside her until she fell asleep, sometimes asking quietly whether she wanted to make a public statement. But Elena wasn't ready. She needed truth, not headlines. Benson, meanwhile, found himself unraveling under the weight of guilt. He stared at the ceiling of his small apartment long after midnight, listening to his infant daughter stir in the next room. He remembered the way Elena flinched as he tore her jacket. He remembered the fear in her eyes when Harlan snapped the cuffs. He told himself he hadn't meant harm, but the truth gnawed at him. He had become exactly what he once swore he would never be. Harlan called him the next morning, voice hard. "If you talk, you'll lose everything. Your job, your family, your future." Benson hung up without responding, for the first time in his career. He wasn't sure whose orders to follow, his superiors or his conscience. That same night, another revelation shook the investigation. Security footage from the governor's home showed Harlan driving past Elena's residence twice in the days before the incident, slowing near the gate before circling away, stalking behavior. When Moreno saw it, she issued an immediate request for a warrant. At 3:15 a.m., Harlan was taken into custody. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He only stared ahead, hollow-eyed, as if the world he built, a world of intimidation, silence, and unchecked power, had finally collapsed. And while the city slept, Chief Lang called his union contacts in desperation, unaware that the FBI had already seized his emails, his financial transfers, and the documents showing he accepted $38,000 in union bribes to bury cases like Harlan's. The truth was no longer hidden. It was unfolding piece by piece, victim by victim, until the full, dark history stood exposed. And by sunrise, Elena understood something she hadn't been able to see the day before. This wasn't just her fight. It was a reckoning long overdue, and she was now at the center of it. By the fourth day of the investigation, the facade that had protected Chicago's police leadership for years began to crumble, and the truth emerged with a weight that could no longer be carried by silence. The FBI's discovery of Chief Edward Lang's emails turned the case from a scandal into a full-blown crisis. In one message, Lang had written to a union representative, "Clear Harlan's file before the election," a line that shredded any illusion of impartial oversight, and when investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a pattern of concealment so deliberate it erased any doubt that the system hadn't merely failed Elena and the other victims. It had been engineered to fail them. Lang had accepted $38,000 in quiet union payments over the course of 6 years. Money routed through consulting fees and training stipends that never existed. The union's lawyer, Victor Klein, had drafted form letters designed to discredit complainants, labeling them unreliable, erratic, or seeking attention. Those same letters appeared in more than a dozen of Harlan's cases. When Moreno read the identical phrasing across years of documents, she whispered, "They built a machine for this." The revelation sent shockwaves through City Hall, where panicked aides attempted to distance themselves from Lang, only to discover that the paper trail made the separation impossible. Public pressure swelled, and the calls for transparency grew louder than the city had anticipated. Victims began stepping forward in larger numbers once they realized they were no longer fighting alone. The FBI arranged a private meeting in a secure downtown conference room, inviting the women whose stories aligned with the pattern of abuse. Elena arrived quietly, not as a public figure, but as a woman who had lived the same terror they had. She walked into a room filled with faces marked by strength and exhaustion. Carla Evans stood near the window, clutching a small photo of her son taken on the day of her assault. A woman named Clarissa, a store clerk from uptown, sat with her arms crossed tightly, speaking only when spoken to, as though the words themselves were painful. Another woman, a retired teacher named Mrs. Allen, described a night in 2014 when Harlan stopped her on her way home from choir rehearsal, forcing her to lift her blouse and endure a barrage of degrading comments. "I filed a complaint," she said softly. "They said the officer acted within protocol." When Elena heard this, her breath tightened. She felt a wave of fury rise beneath her calm exterior. Fury not at the system in theory, but at the human harm it caused. The humiliation burned into memory, the damage carried for years, the isolation each woman had endured believing her experience was singular. But now the truth was out, and the patterns were undeniable. As the stories unfolded, the group found a steady source of strength in one another. Carla spoke of how her 10-year-old son had cried as Harlan screamed at her, begging her not to say anything that would get her in trouble. She told the room that her son had nightmares for months afterward, waking up drenched in sweat, asking if the police would come back for them. When she finished, the room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Elena reached across the table and took Carla's hand, offering a quiet reassurance that carried more force than any speech could muster. In that moment, the women began to see themselves not as isolated victims, but as part of a larger truth that demanded to be heard. Meanwhile, the FBI's pressure on Kyle Benson finally broke through his fear. Benson arrived at the field office 2 days after Harlan's arrest. Shoulders slumped, eyes hollow from lack of sleep. He confessed in a shaking voice that he had followed Harlan because he believed disobedience would destroy his career. He admitted he had seen files disappear, watched Harlan humiliate women, heard him joke about his collection. He spoke about how he froze during Elena's assault, knowing it was wrong yet fearing the consequences of defiance more than the moral cost of silence. "He told me," Benson whispered, "that I needed to learn how to put certain people in their place." When Moreno asked him who certain people meant, Benson swallowed hard and said, "Black women." His statement alone cracked the dam, but the text messages he turned over blew it apart. One thread included Harlan's message from the morning of Elena's assault, "Hunting rich, uppity black today." Another showed Benson's attempts to back out, met with threats from Harlan. "Snitch and you're finished." The FBI documented everything. The case was no longer just about misconduct. It was evidence of a culture shaped by racism, intimidation, and deliberate cover-ups. Late that evening, Elena and Marcus sat at their dining table, reviewing the latest reports. Marcus wanted her to wait before speaking publicly. He feared that a misstep could affect not only her safety, but also the upcoming election. "You know how they twist things," he said softly. "You know they will come after you. After us." Elena listened, but her heart fought the idea of silence. "If I stay quiet," she said, "I protect the people who hurt these women." It was the first time Marcus realized that Elena wasn't merely a victim in this story. She was becoming its catalyst. Their disagreement grew into a tense exchange, not out of anger toward each other, but out of the fear and pressure pressing against them from every direction. When the conversation ended, Marcus kissed her forehead gently, whispering, "Just promise me you'll be careful." She nodded, though she knew caution alone would not be enough in the days ahead. The FBI's mounting evidence forced the city to act. Lang was suspended at noon, escorted out of police headquarters through a side exit to avoid cameras. Though the humiliation stung him deeply, the union immediately distanced itself, claiming they had no knowledge of the payments, though Moreno's team had already uncovered the bank transfers. A civil lawsuit was filed against Lang for intentional suppression of misconduct, and pundits predicted he could lose everything: his pension, his savings, even his home. In the early hours of the next morning, under the weight of public disgrace, Lang attempted to contact several of his political allies, but each call went unanswered. The machine he once helped protect had abandoned him as soon as the headlines turned toxic. At 2 a.m., Harlan attempted suicide in his holding cell. A guard found him unconscious with a torn bedsheet around his neck. Paramedics revived him, but he awoke paralyzed from a spinal cord injury when Moreno received the update. She felt no triumph, only a quiet acknowledgement that he had chosen to escape accountability rather than face the women he had harmed. Meanwhile, the victims gathered strength from one another. Elena called a second meeting, inviting not just the women already known, but several who had only recently come forward. They spoke as a group about what justice should look like. Not only legal consequences, but public acknowledgement and reform, so their daughters would not endure the same trauma. By dawn, Elena realized the truth that now guided her. Their stories were no longer fragments scattered across years. Together, they formed a force powerful enough to reshape a city, and she understood that she was meant to lead that charge. 3 months after the morning that changed her life, Elena stepped into Chicago City Hall with a steadiness that surprised even her. The building pulsed with noise long before she reached the podium. Reporters filled every inch of the lobby, cameras stacked 3 rows deep, microphones sprouting from the lectern like steel branches. Officers stood guard along the walls, not to protect her from danger, but to hold back the surge of journalists desperate for a quote, a reaction, a headline. Elena walked forward slowly, wearing a navy blazer and a quiet expression that carried both exhaustion and resolve. Marcus stood off to the side, hands clasped, eyes fixed on her with a mixture of pride and worry. The city had waited for this moment. The country had waited. And when she finally touched the podium, the room fell into a hush so complete that even the reporters lowered their pens. Elena began by recounting the facts, the morning run. The orders barked without reason, the jacket torn from her body, the humiliation captured on video. Her voice didn't waver. She spoke not as the First Lady of Illinois, but as a woman who had survived the same brutality many others had endured without cameras to prove it. Then she paused, opened a file on the podium, and revealed the evidence the FBI had pieced together. The texts, the photos, the emails. On the screen behind her, a slide appeared. Harlan's message to Benson. "Hunting rich, uppity black today." A murmur swept the room. Some reporters gasped. Others simply closed their eyes. Elena continued, showing the pattern of buried complaints, the payments funneled to Chief Lang, the union's role in the cover-ups. Her tone stayed calm. Even as the crowd rippled with outrage, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The truth, presented plainly, was louder than any anger could ever be. Then she stepped aside, giving the floor to someone whose presence silenced even the most hardened reporters. Dr. Sophia Grant. Sophia walked slowly to the podium, her hands trembling slightly, though her gaze remained steady. She wore a simple gray sweater, her hair pulled back, her posture dignified in a way that hinted at the strength she once had to summon on a dark night in 2019. When she began to speak, her voice was soft but unmistakably clear. She described the night Harlan stopped her as she walked to her car after a double shift, how he searched her without cause, how he made her remove her coat while smirking at her fear. She described the moment he photographed her as she stood against the cold night air, shivering, humiliated, praying no one would drive by and see her like that. She explained how she filed a complaint, believing the system would protect her, only to learn weeks later that her file had been misplaced. Her voice cracked only once, when she said, "I thought it was my fault. I thought I had done something wrong." The room fell silent again. Reporters looked down, shaken. It wasn't just Elena's story now. It was a chorus of wounds the city could no longer pretend not to hear. Federal prosecutor Daniel Reed stepped to the podium next. Holding a thick binder marked with the seal of the Northern District of Illinois, Reed was known for being relentless, a man who rarely smiled, rarely softened, and rarely lost a case. He spoke with the gravity of someone announcing a verdict the city had deserved years ago. After reviewing evidence collected by the FBI, he said, "My office is filing 28 federal charges against Sergeant Frank Harlan, including civil rights violations, aggravated assault, unlawful detention, and the destruction of evidence." Gasps filled the room again. Reed continued. Turning the page, additional charges have been filed against Officer Kyle Benson, who has cooperated with investigators. And as of this morning, Chief Edward Lang has been indicted for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and accepting unlawful compensation. Cameras flashed, casting brief bursts of light across Reed's stern expression. "Let me be clear," he said. "This is not a case about one officer. This is a case about a system that chose to protect power instead of people. Today, that system begins to answer for what it has done." The words echoed across the marble walls, heavy enough to linger long after the microphones were turned off. Near the back of the room, a reporter raised a hand and asked the question everyone had been waiting for. "Dr. Thompson, how are you coping with the trauma?" Elena inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the question settle into her chest. She could have given a polished political answer. She could have brushed the question aside and returned to the facts. But she didn't. Instead, She spoke plainly, her voice carrying the honesty of someone who knew the cost of truth. "I still fear that park," she said quietly. "I fear the sound of footsteps behind me. I fear that another woman, just like me, will be stopped tomorrow, next week, next year, and no one will be there to film it. But fear is not what guides me today. Responsibility is—" The room grew still again. Some reporters lowered their cameras, moved not by spectacle but by sincerity. Marcus blinked several times, absorbing the vulnerability of a woman he had loved for decades. The fallout began within hours. Chief Lang submitted a forced resignation. Though no resignation could shield him from the financial ruin already closing in, lawsuits mounted by the dozen. His pension was frozen, his accounts seized. Political allies distanced themselves so quickly that Lang's name vanished from the city's press releases as if it had never existed. At home. He stared at his living room wall for hours, too stunned to fathom how easily years of manipulation and quiet corruption had unraveled. Meanwhile, Harlan, recovering from his failed suicide attempt and now partially paralyzed, received news of the indictment without reaction. His ex-wife refused to visit. His teenage son sent a single message: "Do not contact me ever again." At the same time, Benson, though terrified of the consequences ahead, felt a small sense of relief for the first time in years. Cooperation didn't absolve him, but it allowed him to breathe in a way he hadn't since joining Harlan's unit. Outside City Hall, hundreds gathered by evening, holding signs that read, "Justice for Elena and Protect Black Women." Cars honked in support. Strangers embraced. Reporters broadcast live feeds to millions. Elena watched from an upstairs window, her hand resting lightly on the glass. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply whispered to herself, "This is only the beginning." She understood that justice wasn't just about indictments. It wasn't a single press conference. It was a long, brutal, necessary process. But for the first time since that morning in Lincoln Park, she felt hope. Quiet, steady hope. The kind that doesn't burn out but grows stronger with every truth revealed. The trial began 6 months after the press conference, drawing national attention long before the first witness took the stand, and by the time the courtroom doors opened, every seat was filled with reporters, victims, community leaders, and quiet observers who knew they were witnessing a turning point for Chicago. Judge Angela Carter, known for her no-nonsense discipline and unwavering fairness, presided with a calm authority that kept both sides in line. Elena sat in the front row beside Sophia and Carla, her posture straight, her hands folded, her breath steady, across the aisle. Frank Harlan appeared in a wheelchair, the failed suicide attempt having left him partially paralyzed, though his expression carried none of the humility his circumstances suggested. His face remained stubborn, jaw clenched, eyes locked forward as if refusing to acknowledge the people he had harmed. Officer Kyle Benson sat 2 rows behind him, head bowed, pale from months of restless nights and the weight of his own conscience. Federal prosecutor Daniel Reed opened with a statement so concise and deliberate that the courtroom leaned in as if absorbing each word into the walls. He presented the case not as a tragedy, but as a pattern, a culture built on intimidation, racism, and unchecked authority. He held up Harlan's phone records, the 89 photos, the threatening texts, and the falsified reports. "This is not misconduct," Reed said solemnly. "This is a man who hunted the vulnerable under the shield of a badge." The defense attempted from the outset to claim qualified immunity, arguing that officers must be allowed to make split-second decisions. But the argument collapsed quickly once the prosecution revealed that many of Harlan's so-called split-second decisions occurred during routine stops involving unarmed black women standing alone in daylight. When Elena took the stand, the courtroom held its breath. She walked forward slowly, her appearance calm, her voice controlled, her presence steady. Reed asked her to recount the morning in Lincoln Park, and as she described the moment the jacket tore, the silence grew heavy and intimate, as though the entire room could feel the sting of that humiliation. But it was when she spoke of her father's beating in 1989 that the courtroom shifted from quiet sympathy to somber understanding. "I know what it means to feel powerless," she said softly. "I know what it means to be treated as less than human. And I know that if this could happen to me, it could happen to any woman in this city." Her words struck deeper than any legal argument could. Even Judge Carter paused, her expression briefly softened before she resumed her practiced neutrality. Sophia then took the stand, and she told her story in a voice so steady it echoed through the courtroom like a plea heard too late. She described the cold cement beneath her feet, the smirk on Harlan's face, the shame that lingered long after she tried to bury it. Carla followed, recounting her son's cries, the trauma it left behind, the nightmares that still haunted him. Each testimony painted a portrait of cruelty too consistent to ignore. The defense struggled. They attempted to frame Harlan as a veteran officer under pressure, a man worn down by years of high-stress encounters. But Reed dismantled that argument by showing that nearly all of Harlan's aggressive stops targeted black women in non-confrontational situations. When the defense claimed the photos were misinterpreted training documentation, the jury visibly recoiled. Then came the whistleblower evidence, Benson's full cooperation. He testified for nearly 4 hours, voice cracking more than once, recounting the culture of fear Harlan had created in their unit. He spoke of the morning texts, the threats, the pressure to follow orders, the fear of losing his job if he questioned anything. When Reed asked him what he felt when he tore Elena's jacket, Benson lowered his head and whispered, "Shame. A shame I can't undo." His cooperation earned him some sympathy from the jury, but not enough to erase his role. Meanwhile, the evidence against Chief Lang was equally damning. The financial records, the emails, the secret meetings, all pointed to deliberate obstruction. And when union lawyer Victor Klein was confronted with documents he had tried to hide, his defense deteriorated into excuses Judge Carter dismissed as evasion dressed as confusion. Midway through the trial, a surprising development occurred. Harlan sent a handwritten apology letter to Elena through his attorney. Reed placed the sealed envelope on her table. She stared at it for a moment, then tore it in half without opening it. The courtroom watched, silent, as she placed the pieces to the side. It wasn't an act of anger. It was a refusal to let a hollow apology dilute the truth. The trial continued for 26 days, each one adding weight to the story the jury already knew by heart, and on the final day, Judge Carter delivered sentences that reflected the gravity of the crimes. Harlan was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. Benson, taking full responsibility for his involvement and cooperating with investigators, received 12 years. Lang was given 18 for conspiracy and obstruction. Union lawyer Victor Klein, once confident in his ability to evade consequences, received 7, as the courtroom emptied. Elena felt the first true exhale she had taken in months. But the story was not over. The Department of Justice announced a 4-year consent decree to oversee Chicago PD reforms, mandating independent oversight, body camera accountability, and new disciplinary procedures. Lawmakers passed the Elena Thompson Act, a statewide requirement that all officers wear body cameras with encrypted retention standards. Elena established a $62 million support fund through private donors and state partnerships, providing legal aid, trauma counseling, and financial assistance to 47 victims. The city's landscape began to shift. The public demanded more. Investigations reopened, and within months, the number of civilian complaints plummeted, not because misconduct disappeared overnight, but because officers finally understood that accountability was no longer optional. Harlan's time in prison was far from the quiet escape he imagined. He was assaulted twice during his intake period, leaving him permanently disabled, with guards placing him under continuous monitoring. Benson entered a medium security facility and, in a turn that surprised even the harshest critics, enrolled in a prison reform program, speaking openly about accountability and the dangers of unchecked authority. He apologized publicly, not to absolve himself, but to contribute something meaningful to those he had harmed, and through it all. Elena carried herself with a quiet strength that steadied the people around her. She understood that justice was not a single sentence or a single law. It was a long road paved with truth, courage, and persistence. Outside the courthouse that final day, reporters called her name, asking how she felt. She paused for a moment, letting the sunlight warm her face. Then she answered with a calm, steady clarity. "This is not the end. This is the beginning of the work we must all do." Her voice carried through the crowd, reaching the victims standing behind her, the officers standing before her, and the millions watching from home. It was the truth. And it was the beginning of a legacy far larger than the trial itself. 21 months after the morning that changed her life. Elena returned to Lincoln Park before sunrise, her breath steady in the cool air, her footsteps slow and intentional as she followed the same path where everything began. The park was quiet, the kind of quiet that allows a person to hear their own thoughts with honesty. And she felt a gentle ache in her chest, not from fear, but from the memory of how far she had come. Near the bench where she once stretched, a bronze plaque now stood mounted on a smooth stone, engraved with the names of 19 victims whose stories had surfaced during the investigation. She paused in front of it, letting her fingertips rest lightly on the cold metal. For a moment, she closed her eyes and whispered each name in her mind, honoring them not as a politician's statement but as a woman who had shared their pain. Then she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Carla Evans approaching with her son, now taller, more confident, his face no longer carrying the fear that once haunted him. Carla gave Elena a soft smile, the kind that comes from gratitude earned through hardship. "We made it through," she said quietly. Elena nodded, feeling a warm heaviness settle inside her. "We did," she answered, though she knew the road was still long. They talked for several minutes about Carla's new role as an advocate for police accountability, her speeches in schools, her work with families who lacked resources to fight the system. Elena listened, encouraged by the strength that had grown in Carla since the first night they met in the victim's circle. It reminded her that justice wasn't only measured in verdicts or settlements, but in the way surviving women found their voices again and used them to guide others toward safety. A week earlier, news had reached Elena that Frank Harlan had died of heart failure in prison. When she heard it, she didn't feel triumph or relief, only a quiet acceptance that his story had reached an ending of its own. She didn't open the second letter he had attempted to send in his final months. She didn't need to. Redemption was not hers to grant. Meanwhile, Kyle Benson's story took a different path. After serving time with good behavior and completing counseling programs, he was released early on parole, instead of disappearing from the public eye. He surprised many by volunteering with an organization that worked with at-risk youth, telling his story openly, acknowledging the power he had misused, warning young men about the danger of following orders without moral courage. Some criticized him, some forgave him. Elena neither condemned nor praised him, but she respected the fact that he chose a life of responsibility rather than denial. Edward Lang, once a powerful figure who moved through City Hall with confidence, now lived alone in a modest apartment far from his old neighborhood. His savings were drained by civil lawsuits, his pension frozen, his friends scarce. He spent most days indoors, watching news segments that no longer mentioned him, realizing that his name would be remembered not for leadership, but for complicity. Elena never spoke of him publicly. The justice system had spoken clearly enough in the months following the trial. Elena's influence reached far beyond Chicago. She delivered a TED Talk titled "The Weight We Carry and the Justice We Build." And her voice, calm and measured, resonated around the world. She spoke about trauma, about courage, about the quiet strength required to challenge a system built on fear. She reminded audiences that justice does not come from anger alone, but from persistence rooted in compassion. Millions watched. Thousands wrote to her. Some called her a symbol of justice. Others called her a beacon of hope. She didn't claim either title. She simply carried her story forward because she knew silence had never protected anyone. Marcus, once hesitant to let the world see their private pain, stood proudly at her side through every appearance. His re-election months earlier had been a landslide, 68% of the vote, a number that spoke to the shift in the public conscience. People who once doubted Elena's story now understood that her truth reflected something far larger than one incident. And when she told Marcus she was considering running for the U.S. Senate, he didn't argue or warn her about the scrutiny. He simply took her hand, kissed her forehead, and said, "You're ready." Their daughter, Sarah, now deep into her clinical rotations at Harvard Medical School, called her the night the news leaked. "Mom, you've changed more lives than you know," she said. Elena smiled gently, aware that her daughter had carried her own fear through the ordeal, but now stood taller because of it. In the city she had fought so hard to protect, real change took root. Complaints against the police dropped by 52% as new oversight systems took hold. Community trust rose by 40% in neighborhoods that had once been paralyzed by fear. Officers underwent new training, not the superficial kind meant to check a box, but training shaped by real voices, real victims, real data showing what happens when power loses accountability. The Elena Thompson Act reshaped the use of body cameras statewide, creating a system where footage could not be hidden, altered, or erased without consequences. The Victim Support Fund she established reached 47 survivors, offering therapy, legal guidance, and financial relief. That fund became a model for other states, proving that healing requires resources, not just apologies. Now, standing before the plaque, Elena felt the weight of her journey settle gently on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a reminder. The morning light stretched across the path, casting soft shadows that danced across the stone. She thought of her father. She thought of Sophia. She thought of every woman who had walked into the courtroom with their heads held high despite the pain they carried. She whispered, "We changed everything." Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew the truth in her bones. Then she stepped back, lifted her chin, and began her run, a slow, steady, confident 5-mile path through the same park where she once felt fear. Her strides grew stronger with each step. The air felt lighter, and as she moved forward, she understood that healing was not a destination, but a practice. Justice, too, was something she would continue to build every day. She ran toward the future with a calm heart, knowing that the legacy she had forged was larger than her own pain, larger than the trial, larger even than the reforms she helped pass. It was a legacy born from courage, carried by community, and strengthened by every woman who refused to stay silent again. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps these stories reach more people.